meeting as well? All right. Well, it is 9:04 on October 8th, 2021. I'd like to now call this meeting of the Climate Initiatives Task Force to order. Ms. Kinchin, can you please call the roll? Ms. Kinchin, can you hear us?
She's going to come over here. The audio is messed up.
Gotcha.
Mr. Vorhoff,
Here.
Mr. Moses,
Here.
Mr. Grandy,
Here.
Mr. Lambert,
Here.
Mr. Lanklos, Dr. Brown, Mr. Idaraldi.
I see Dr. Brown on mute here.
Okay. Mr. Joey Bro,
Here.
Dr. Calavota,
Here.
Ms. Shelby Bush, Mr. Timothy Hardy / Tony Combs, Mr. Robertson,
Here.
Tyler Gray,
Here.
Greg Bowser, Jonathan Bork,
Here.
Dr. Virginia Burkett, Karen Gotro, Mr. Flonels Daniels,
Here.
Terrence Chambers,
Here.
Jeff Swartz, Colette Pichon Battle, Chief Dardar, Rob Verchick,
Here.
Camille Manning Broom.
I'm present, and Dr. Burkett also said present, but she was on mute.
Thank you. You
Yeah.
have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Kinchin. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see your faces. I think it's only right to start our meeting by recognizing that since we last met at the end of July, as you all know very well, Southeast Louisiana was hit by one of the worst hurricanes in Louisiana's history. Hurricane Ida caused significant damage and hardship to many of our communities, especially down in Bayou Country and in the river parishes. Many of our people and some of our fellow task force members are still very much picking up the pieces and in disaster response and recovery mode. I ask that we all keep them front of mind today and as we move forward. We didn't need a reminder of why we're doing this work, but let us rededicate ourselves to our mission of determining how to set Louisiana on a path to net zero in order to minimize the frequency and severity of these kinds of storms, which is just one of the symptoms of climate change that we are trying to minimize or avoid. Today is the first of two meetings focusing on industrial decarbonization. Today we'll be taking a broad look at this sector and learn more about the available tools in the toolbox or plays in the playbook. On October 19th, we'll do a deep dive on carbon capture, what it is, what it isn't, identify opportunities, and address concerns. We're having two meetings on industrial decarbonization for a few reasons. First, as we've heard from Dr. Dismukes, industrial emissions represent about 2/3 of our total emissions in this state. Second, the industrial sector is varied and complex. And these meetings will serve to help educate ourselves and the public on what the industrial sector looks like in Louisiana and what strategies and technologies are available to decarbonize. And lastly, no other state has taken a comprehensive look at industrial decarbonization, meaning we have an opportunity to become a leader in this space, which includes technology and policy development and implementation. If we do this right, Louisiana can export both technology and know-how, as well as policies to reduce industrial emissions, which make up about 20% of global emissions. We've invited experts in this space to present to us today and at our follow-up meeting on the 19th to help arm us with the information that we'll need to make informed recommendations. Because we are trying to cover a lot of ground today, we invited Heidi Stiller with NOAA to serve as our facilitator over the next 2 meetings. And I'll introduce Heidi in just a few minutes. But before moving on to the next agenda item, I want to make sure everyone's clear on the upcoming schedule. And Lindsay, could you share the slide of the schedule? Just make sure everybody's clear, sort of put this meeting in context. But as Lindsay is working to pull it up, just a reminder at the end of the day, we'll close our comment period on the draft portfolio and the context document. On the week of the 18th, we'll have our deep dive on carbon capture. Dr. Dismukes will also be sharing his final greenhouse gas inventory. And also that week of the 18th, Energy Innovation and the Water Institute will be publicly launching the Louisiana Energy Policy Simulator, which is an interactive tool to see how much greenhouse gas reductions certain policies can achieve and how those policies can interact with each other to amplify cuts in emissions. And we saw a little bit of that tool at work at our last meeting in July. And then following the week of the 18th, on the 26th, we'll have our next regularly scheduled task force meeting where we'll review the comments from our advisor groups, committees, and the public on the draft portfolio. We'll then have another meeting the week of November 15th and release the updated draft climate plan around that time as well. So about 4 public meetings in the next 6 weeks, lots to do over the coming months, but I know we're all up to the tasks. And so with that, I will move to our next agenda item, which is approval of the minutes, which were circulated shortly after our initial meeting, but also appended to the calendar invite. Hope everybody's had a chance to review. Is there a motion to adopt the minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve.
We have a motion by Camille Manning Broom. Is there a second?
Motion is second.
Who said that? Sorry.
Greg.
Okay, you got a second by Greg Grandy. Any discussion? Any public comment? All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, nay. Right. Meeting minutes adopted. So next, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. Heidi Stiller is the South Regional Director for NOAA's National Ocean Service Office for Coastal Management. Heidi serves as a focal point for senior level coastal partner interactions at the regional, state, and local levels from North Carolina to Texas. She helps implement national and regional coastal and ocean programs and connects on the ground partners with NOAA products and services. Before joining NOAA, Heidi worked for the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management and the Florida Coastal Management Program. Planning that incorporates hazard mitigation, climate adaptation, and coastal and natural resource sustainability is a focus of Heidi's work, including providing data and tools to help communities address coastal inundation risks. She has experience with post-disaster recovery planning, especially in Louisiana, and has received and recently received as an author on the coastal chapter of the 4th National Climate assessment. And so if you haven't had the privilege of meeting Heidi before, she is excellent at keeping meetings going and facilitating discussion. And so we thought, because we have so much to get through today and in our meeting next in a couple of weeks, we could certainly benefit from her experience in that department. And so with that, Heidi, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Harry. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. It really is a pleasure to join you. As Harry said, I'm just here to keep us on time, do a little bit of moderating. And so I'm going to start off today just going over quickly our objectives for the day and sort of run of show what the agenda is. And then we will dive right in. So our objectives today, first one, of course, is to really just learn from the experts that we've invited to join us. And these folks are going to talk to us about the need to start the process of industrial decarbonization, share some high-profile information about industry in Louisiana and components of industrial decarbonization. We'll also dive into some of the policy approaches so we can get our brains around the possible ways to tackle this. And then also talk about feasibility and some potential roadblocks. So that's the first objective, is to really just learn from our speakers. Secondly, we want to have some group discussion, and we want to talk about benefits, costs, trade-offs, and implications of different approaches we might take. And then finally, we do want to loop this back to the actions that you all are working on, and see if there are changes, additions that you want to make to that profile of actions. As far as schedule goes, we'll be hearing from our speakers for about the first hour and a half. We'll have 2 sessions. We'll hear from our first 3 speakers, and then we'll take some time for Q&A. Then we'll hear from our last 2 speakers, and again, a little bit of time for Q&A. That should bring us to just about 10:30. We will take a 15-minute break so everyone can get some more caffeine. And then when we come back from break, then we'll have our moderated discussion, and we'll be sure to wrap up on time. So before we dive right in, any questions about process type things?
I'd just like to let the record reflect that Greg Bowser and Tim Hardy have joined the meeting as well.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Harry.
Right, Colette Pichon Battle is here as well.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us. So as we're getting underway here, if you have a burning question about industrial decarbonization, something you've been wondering about, please do type that into the chat, and that will help our speakers. They might be able to address some of those questions along the way. But as I said, we will have time for Q&A after each set of speakers. We will be trying to stick to a pretty tight schedule. So if our speakers run along, I will be jumping in just to keep us on time. So with that, I'll turn it back to Harry, who's going to introduce our first 3 speakers this morning.
Thank you, Heidi. So we'll have the first 3 speakers really address the context for action and methods to industrial decarbonization. And so we'll start with Rachel Cletus with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and then who will be followed by Ed Ryder with the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, who will then be followed by Jeffrey Risman with Energy Innovation. And so without any further ado, Dr. Cletus, would you please?
Thank you so much, Harry, and thank you so much, all of you, for this opportunity to be here today. It's a real honor, and I am have so much respect and admiration for the enterprise that you're all embarked on here. It is the essence of what's needed in this moment. Lindsay, thank you so much for helping run the slides. If you wouldn't mind putting up the slides, I'll try to keep this brief with the 10 minutes. So I just want to start, my job here was to set the stage with where we are in the latest science. And in a nutshell, it's sobering. We are in a narrowing window of opportunity to help limit some of the worst impacts of climate change. And Louisiana is uniquely exposed to those impacts, as you all know from firsthand experience, but also, as others have said earlier today, uniquely poised to be a leader in addressing how we go about limiting the worst of these impacts. Next slide, please. Sorry, we can skip this one. I'm from the Union of Concerned Scientists. I think that was in the bio. Just to set the stage a little bit from the science perspective, what we've seen in the last few years is a relentless drumbeat of new reports that are continuing to highlight the greater urgency around the need to act. So we have known the basics of climate science and what's driving the changes we're seeing for decades, if not over a century now. We know that our heat trapping emissions from burning fossil fuels and cutting down tropical forests are contributing to this rising increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases. But right here on Earth, what's happening is that we're seeing this relentless rise in global average temperatures, year-on-year record-breaking temperatures. The last 20 years have been record-breaking relative to the historical record. And that means young people today who are in college have not seen a normal year without these record-breaking temperatures. And we're at a little over a degree Celsius in global average temperature increase. The impacts are already profound and they're here all around us. This is a snapshot of just last year in the US, the $20 billion weather and climate related disasters. And you all see yourselves in this map, because unfortunately there was a series of storms that came ashore in Louisiana and around the Gulf South that greatly affected people's lives, but also were very, very costly. The fourth National Climate Assessment underscores this. Louisiana is uniquely exposed to sea level rise in particular, but also extreme heat, extreme rainfall, all of which are very devastating. The EPA just released a report last month pointing out that climate change especially is taking a devastating toll on communities that are socially or economically vulnerable to these impacts. Next slide, please. The IPCC 1.5C report released in 2018 made very clear that to help limit some of the worst impacts, we're going to have to get to net zero latest by 2050. And of the illustrative pathways they looked at, pretty much all of them are pointing to the fact that it's not just about 2050, it's about the next decade. We are in a very consequential decade. The next 10 years are crucial. We have to halve global warming emissions globally by 2030. And the US, as a richer nation, has to move first. We are one of the largest emitters, historically the largest emitter on a cumulative basis, and therefore need to be getting out well ahead. Next slide, please. An IPCC report released in August this year continued to reinforce this message. The IPCC Physical Science Basis report that was released, basically pointing out, next slide, please, that it's indisputable that our activities are causing climate change and that we need the sustained reductions. Next slide, please. The report also made clear that we're not talking about a future, we're talking about a here and now. These consequential impacts are already here. And the report also is increasingly pointing out the implications of where our choices still about the future and where we could go. This graph is essentially capturing a snapshot of where we are today. It's unprecedented relative to the historic record. If you look at that left graph in terms of the temperature increase driven by our emissions. Next slide. But the future is in our hands still, and that's critical because the IPCC report also lays out different pathways to our future. And if you look at these graphs, there's a lot of information here, but what I want to focus you on is on the left graph. We need to be staying on those lower blue lines. If our emissions and if our pathways get to those higher lines, we're talking about irreversible kinds of changes that are so profound to ecosystems, to human livelihoods, to human lives. So staying on that lower trajectory means cutting emissions very, very sharply, not just CO2, all heat trapping gases, including methane. Next slide, please. We can skip this one. This one's pretty obvious. Every ton of CO2 is adding to global warming emissions, and therefore our choices, the choices we make now, this narrowing window is critical. Next slide. Here in Louisiana, this is a snapshot of what happened last year when you had a relentless series of storms and the effect it had on what is one of the very vital sources of income in the state. You're seeing directly that the very sectors that are contributing to heat trapping emissions are also finding themselves on the front lines of the impacts when these intensifying storms hit. And this fact that you are starting to see storms that intensify so rapidly because they're going over warmer ocean waters and they're carrying more rain in them because warmer air carries more moisture is a classic fingerprint of climate change. It means less time for people to get out of harm's way. It means that big major storms spin up so quickly that it's hard to get out ahead in terms of shutting down operations for businesses, et cetera. Next slide. The science is pretty clear on this. This is science done in 2016 based on an intense rainfall event in Louisiana that I'm sure you all remember. These ones don't even make national headlines because it's not about a hurricane, but you all know these heavy rainfall events are getting worse. And this particular paper was pointing out that the possibility, the risk of these intense rainfalls in 2016 was increased at least 40% because of climate change. Next slide. We're also starting to see these risks compound. And as you saw with Hurricane Ida, more people died from the extreme heat and the power outages that compounded that in the aftermath of the storm than from the immediate impacts of the storm. This again is the kind of future we're seeing get worse and worse even right now. Next slide, please. We ourselves at UCS have done a number of pieces of research on sea level rise and extreme heat. I'm going to go through these very quickly in the interest of time, but one of the key features I want to point out here is climate change is affecting us all, but it is affecting some communities much, much worse because of socioeconomic factors, because of longstanding structural racism and inequities. Communities are being more exposed. Less resources to cope with upfront, and then much, much harder to get back on their feet after these impacts. When you had your power go out after Ida went down, after Ida caused power outages, you really have to think about the communities that are more isolated, more remote, have fewer resources, like the Huma Nation, that experienced an even longer period of outages and disruptions long after the event drops out of the headlines. So that's what we have to be thinking about in this climate altered future. Next slide, please. This is a slide of our research showing what extreme heat will look like in our nation if we take action or if we don't in the mid-century. And in the mid-century, you can see Louisiana on that map. They're uniquely red and exposed. The Southeast as a whole very exposed, but Louisiana certainly, and extreme heat is going to compound with sea level rise to create greater challenges. Next slide. This is a snapshot of our data from Louisiana, and you can see there've been 28 days per year with a heat index above 100 in the past, and that's going to increase to 97 years on average by mid-century, 129 by the end of the century. Really, really profound changes. Next slide. We can skip this one. Next slide, please. And this, we also have research on the impacts on outdoor workers, including folks who work on rigs and other places in Louisiana. So just noting that some populations are uniquely exposed. Next slide, please. What I do want to say is our choices now do matter, and we do have choices in terms of cutting our emissions. You all are engaged in an exercise around cutting industrial emissions, which is very, very important. Power sector, transportation, industrial sector, together, we really have to be looking economy-wide. We can't be doing this in isolation, just thinking about heat trapping emissions. We really have to think about the systems that are creating these rising emissions. Our fossil fuel-based energy system has to be shifted. And how we do this really, really matters. We have to be thinking about jobs, justice, equity, so that the burden of the shift is not falling disproportionately on some communities relative to others. So we've also released some research and a framework about how to go about making these changes. Yes, we know the endpoint. We have to get off fossil fuels as much as possible, cut emissions sharply, but how we get there really, really matters. And that is the crux of what you all are wrestling with. And it is the call of the hour. But done right, we can get multiple benefits: public health, addressing environmental justice considerations, even as we address climate change, as well as creating jobs in new clean energy industries. Next slide, please.
Rachel, I am going to ask you to wrap it up.
Sure, we can skip through the next few. I think that this is obvious in terms of where we shift. I did want to stop here for a second just to point out that we are facing multiple crises at the same time. And it's very, very important that our solutions align along all of these axes. We're not going to solve climate in a corner somewhere. It's deeply connected to people's lives, livelihoods, and the future of our nation and the state of Louisiana, of course. So welcome thoughts across these multiple facets. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Rachel. Much appreciated. We'll go right to Ed as our second speaker.
Okay, you should be seeing a screen.
It's not up just yet. Here it comes. We've got it.
Okay, well, that's coming. I'd also like to thank the organizers, Lindsay and all, for the opportunity to speak. And following Rachel's comments and given a preview of it, setting the stage for those from Jeff, I'm going to talk about strategies and opportunities connected with industrial decarbonization. Hitting 4 topics: where greenhouse gas emissions come from associated with energy, strategies and what's called pillars of decarbonization, as well as calling your attention to a few roadmaps that may be of interest, as well as the routes to pursue opportunities. Whoops. So just to act as a reminder, 5 sectors account for the majority of emissions, CO2 emissions, and across the industry accounts for about 28% in the US of greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that those 5 sectors are refining, chemicals, iron and steel, food, and cement. I'll also point out that the majority of those emissions, at least from the energy use perspective, come from process heat. Process heat then is one of the large cross-cutting opportunities in the space for industrial decarbonization that one needs to consider. You also see the machine drives are an important component as well. And I'll talk about that a bit more in just a minute. All right. So as I mentioned, process heat, excuse me, it's important to point out where that heat comes from and the ranges of process heat. So you can see in this case that for chemicals, as well as refining, there's a fair amount of the process heat that's under 150 degrees C. That relatively low temperature process heat is amenable to electrification by technologies such as industrial heat pumps, microwaves, infrared, and several other different technologies that are already commercial. But in large part, they have not been adopted at scale at very large percentage, in part due to the relative cost of electricity versus natural gas. So again, I'll underscore process heat here. Jeff's going to talk about that a little bit more, but I wanted to point out the nature of that cross-cutting opportunity. So let me talk about some strategies for decarbonization. And first, I'll mention what I mean by decarbonization. So decarbonization, my viewpoint, is decreasing the carbon emissions associated with industrial processes. It's not necessarily taking away the nature of the products that are dependent on carbon. So in other words, what's needed is to change the source and the carbon intensity of products, and not the fact that they're going to be based on carbon themselves. So the first one that I'll introduce here is to decarbonize power. So that's natural gas, that's electricity, and also feedstocks. Feedstocks are the source of the materials such as carbon that's used in making polymers and other materials, as well as decarbonizing other materials inputs. Second, I'll point out that it's important to decarbonize processes. These within the pots and pans, if you will, within industry, it's changing the way that those processes are used to make products. So process heat, of course, is a part of that equation. And it's also important to make every unit of energy count. And that's where efficiency, not only energy efficiency, but materials efficiency and others come in. It's important as well to think about the supply chains. A number of companies have seen that the majority of their carbon emissions are connected with their supply chains. For example, General Motors has seen that more than 90% of their emissions are associated with their supply chain use of their products, cars. So it's really important to think about supply chains. Of course, they're complex, but that's part of the story that we need to work with. Finally, I'll note that it's really important to increase market pull for low carbon products. Now, Rebecca is going to tell us a bit more about that, but for industry to make those products, it's important that the customers demand and in fact are willing to pay some for those low carbon products. Four basic strategies I'll mention. One is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is the lowest cost, lowest capital route to making reductions. Energy substitution, we've talked about electrification, that's where that would fit. And also low carbon fuels and feedstocks are important. That's where renewable hydrogen might come in. Finally, even if you pursue aggressively those first three pillars of decarbonization, there may be emissions left over. And that's where mitigation strategies such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage will come in. So I'll note that there are a number of roadmaps in this space connected with industrial decarbonization. I'll point out three in this case. One that was particular to the chemical industries was done by the International Council for Chemical Associations, International Energy Agency, and DECA in 2013. And it looks at the potential for catalytic processes to make improvements to reduce their energy and greenhouse gases. Second, I'll note one from LB&L and Pacific Northwest National Laboratories in E3 back in 2014 that looks at pathways for deep decarbonization, particularly large scale reductions. And finally, there's one from the National Academy of Sciences that came out recently that talks not only about the improvements needed for sectors, but also talks about the socio-economic challenges with this pathway as well. To give you a brief snapshot from another roadmap that's being worked on from the Department of Energy, which is near final. It's in the final review stages, but I'll give you a glimpse at some of the components that have been published. What this shows is that across those pillars that I just introduced, there are different ways that they can be implemented. It shows that by 2030, energy efficiency has the greatest potential to make the reductions because again, it's the lowest capital solution, it's the fastest to start, the industry knows it, it's not dependent on infrastructure, et cetera. Those that are more dependent on infrastructure in place, such as carbon capture utilization, electrification, et cetera, can have some impact by 2030, but you can see that their greatest impact comes in later years when that infrastructure is in place. You'll also note that at 2050, there still remains some CO2 emissions in place. That's where additional mitigation strategies such as forestry and others need to come into play. We don't know at this point of those additional strategies, but we know that they are in fact needed. I'll note also from that work, this slide that shows a landscape of the opportunities and the needs by those four pillars. So what this shows is that there are places where we can immediately start to make improvements where RD&D is needed, and those investments continue to go across this timeline towards 2050. So we need to build the capabilities. We need to build the knowledge to make further improvements and to do things we know are not possible today, but we know that they need to be possible. That's where RD&D needs to make innovations. I'll also note that there are cross-cutting components as well. So for example, renewable hydrogen could have benefits not only in the low carbon fuels space for like renewable hydrogen for the production of ammonia, but improved electrolysis capabilities can also have benefits in the areas such as producing chemicals from low carbon feedstocks. So let me note, of course, that there are a number of barriers and challenges in this space, including the fact that the industrial sector is incredibly heterogeneous. If you look at iron and steel, there are dozens of products. In the chemical industry in the US, there are over 70,000 products that are made. So thinking about decarbonizing chemicals, for example, is a daunting task. There also are technologies that have very long lifetimes. For example, some industrial equipment can be in place for 30 to 40 years. So by 2050, you may only have one opportunity to make a change. Hence, it's really important to get in place policy quickly that can help to provide the right incentives. I'll also note that associated with these barriers, there are also innovation opportunities. So Harry mentioned the opportunity for Louisiana to be on the forefront here in innovation. And I would highlight that these innovation areas are opportunities for Louisiana as well to show its capabilities and then to leverage those to other states. I'll note that as important it is to note the benefits of reduced energy and greenhouse gases, it's also important in thinking about these technologies to think about non-energy benefits. Rachel highlighted the impacts for communities. For example, it's also important to think about adoption and what you can do to accelerate the adoption of these technologies. And sometimes, often, I should say, the non-energy benefits can be a deciding factor in the economics of these types of technologies being adopted. It's also important to consider about a new sheet, a clean sheet for the design of chemical processes and refineries as well. And that's where concepts of green chemistry and engineering can come in with ways to improve the circularity of products and processes.
And I'm jumping in just to urge you to wrap it up.
Yep, got 2 slides to go. So I'll note here for the call of action, it's important to think about roadmaps, describe the opportunities. There's opportunities here for white spaces for new innovation. And what we can see in front of us is challenging, but what we can see further out is a lot fuzzier. So we need to have an agile path to make those kinds of improvements. Finally, there's some references in my slides, and I'll look forward to any questions you might have.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I love that slide that has all the benefits, many things. I want to look back at that one for sure. All right, with that, we're going to turn it to our third speaker, Jeff, and after Jeff, we'll have some time for Q&A.
Thank you. Ed, can you please end sharing your screen so I can share mine? Ed, could you please go to the top of your screen and end sharing so that I can share my screen? Thank you.
Okay, found it.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Rissman, and I'd like to focus this presentation on the ways to decarbonize the chemicals industry, and I'm also going to cover other policies that will help to decarbonize other industries in Louisiana. So The chemicals industry includes, we're going to cover the emissions sources briefly, and then the technologies and processes that can decarbonize chemicals. And then we're going to look at policy options to get us there. So first, here is an overview of the emissions from the industrial sector in Louisiana. This is from the Louisiana State University's greenhouse gas inventory this year. So you can see that chemical manufacturing is the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions within the industrial sector in Louisiana. That's why I'm focusing on that industry in this presentation. Also because it's one of the more complicated sectors and therefore deserves attention. So what is the chemicals industry? Well, they produce chemicals. This is one way to divide them up. This is from this division is from the American Chemistry Council, where you have basic chemicals, agricultural chemicals, specialty chemicals, and then consumer products. Lots of examples are listed there. We'll be looking particularly at petrochemicals here, which make up a large share of energy use and feedstock usage. So these are the petrochemicals, the key building blocks for many other downstream chemicals. So, and then we have, to give you a sense of how large each one is, we have that global production number in the center column there. And then example uses. Fertilizers and plastics tend to be the two largest outputs, but then you can see some other examples beyond the fertilizers and plastics. So first, let's talk about feedstocks. So what does that mean? Well, fossil fuels or inputs or fuel inputs are used by the chemicals industry for two purposes. So about 41% globally are burned to provide heat and power to drive chemical reactions and so on, whereas 59% are physically transformed into the products. So the petrochemicals like the ones we just saw and petrochemical products like plastics, rather than being burned for energy. And you can see on the right here is a diagram showing the heat demand by temperature category for the chemicals industry. So a lot of it is high temperature heat, and then a significant chunk is at the lower 200 degrees C and below. So this diagram is a little complicated, but it gives you a sense of feedstock, of the use of feedstocks by the chemicals industry. This is a global diagram. So you can see that the coal, natural gas, oil, and then some of the petrochemicals are actually produced in refineries rather than chemical industry facilities. The petrochemicals are in the center. They're the same ones we looked at in the earlier slide. And then you can see the output products on the right, where you can see fertilizers and plastics are the largest, and then you have the other categories there. So you might think, why are we even decarbonizing feedstocks? Because they go into the products, right? Do they reach the atmosphere? And there are two reasons. One is something called process emissions. So aside from burning fossil fuels for energy and heat, there can be emissions associated with the industrial processes that occur. And of the carbon dioxide emissions from the chemicals industry, about 15% are process emissions. So that's basically the difference between the amount of carbon in the feedstocks and the amount of carbon that ends up in the final products. So, so if you've decarbonized the feedstocks, then these emissions can be from zero carbon, from net zero CO2 or the like, recovered CO2. The other reason is that the final products are not necessarily secure long-term stores of carbon. So you saw that fertilizers are the largest category of outputs, and there are others like fuel additives that release their carbon pretty much as soon as the product is used, when it's spread in the fields, when the fuel is burned. Even plastics, which are longer lived than fertilizers, they often reach their end of product life within a few years. Many are incinerated, others will break down over decades. So they are not meant to be secure ways to store carbon. So one way to decarbonize feedstocks is to combine hydrogen with captured CO2. So you can use electrolysis, which means taking zero carbon electricity and splitting water into oxygen and hydrogen. There are other techniques like methane pyrolysis that can potentially generate clean hydrogen. Then you get the CO2 from combustion or from other chemical transformations, the process emissions I mentioned, or even from another industry where, for example, you could capture the CO2 from the cement industry when they form cement. The key challenge of this route is the capital and electricity costs of getting that zero carbon hydrogen. Then once you have hydrogen and CO2, you can make petrochemicals. You'll start to see these colored badges here where I indicate how far along each technology is, and I break it out into 4 rough categories: commercial, early commercial, demonstration, and R&D. So I won't have time to talk about these technologies in great detail because there are a good number and they're complicated. But I will point out that green hydrogen is a drop-in replacement for fossil-derived hydrogen and ammonia. There are commercial processes to make methanol, and olefins, the aromatics, are not as far along. You can also use biomass as a feedstock, and there are several ways to do this. So you can get ethylene, which is an input to plastics, from ethanol. You can get methanol from biomass gasification. And then there are the olefins and aromatics can come from that methanol, which as discussed in the previous slide. And then there's ways to replace carbon black as well. So the challenges here are bringing down costs and so on. I need to move on to the non-feedstock energy use. Remember that 41% of the chemicals industry energy use for heat and power, and there's a breakout there by fuel. So there are strategies that are useful for many industries, not just chemicals. So for the low temperature heat, about up to 150, maybe 165 Celsius, you can use industrial heat pumps, which are like the version for buildings. They move heat in by taking it from a heat source. Then there's many technologies for medium temperature. Examples include electric resistance, dielectric heating, that's like microwaves and radio waves to heat, infrared heating, etc. And then for high temperature, you have solutions like induction, electric arcs, lasers. You can also generate green hydrogen in the ways noted above, and then burn it or convert it to hydrogen-derived fuels like methanol or synthetic hydrocarbons, or use bioenergy. And then there's carbon capture, which is going to be the topic of the subsequent workshop. I'm going to briefly mention a few strategies specific to the chemicals industry now, because this presentation wants to focus on chemicals. So one is electrified steam cracking. So steam crackers are a major type of equipment in the chemicals industry that breaks down large hydrocarbons. And there is already a consortium of chemical companies working to develop electrified steam crackers. Another way is to improve catalysts, including catalytic cracking. So a catalyst accelerates a chemical reaction by lowering the energy inputs needed. Since there are many different chemical outputs, you can have many different opportunities for catalysts. But one of the more promising ones is catalytic cracking of hydrocarbons. That's done in refineries today, but not as much in chemicals plants. The first non-refinery chemical plant to do this began operation in South Korea in 2017. So it saves energy by operating at a lower temperature. Last specific chemical strategy I want to mention here is getting methanol from the partial oxidation of methane. Again, due to time, I can't go into it too deeply, but it's a route that saves energy by avoiding the need to do an intermediate step that produces a synthetic gas mixture. And then there are non-CO2 emissions from the chemicals industry, the fluorinated gases they produce, nitrous oxide and methane. And there are ways to decarbonize or to remove these as well. The last slide I have is on policies. Since we don't have time, I won't be able to go into these too deeply, but I think it's worth it to show you sort of this full spectrum of policy options where you have different financial policies, R&D promotion, performance standards, and other policies like green government procurement. And many of these, which I'm highlighting here, are already in Louisiana's draft action plan. So there's numerous opportunities to incentivize all the techniques that I've discussed in this presentation and others to decarbonize industry. We can do this, and we know how, and we should get started today. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. That was great. So we have had a few questions come into the chat, and for time reasons, I'm just going to read them and ask our speakers to respond. First one is for Ed from Maya. You spoke about low carbon fuels, but didn't use the word solar power, wind, renewable energy. You mentioned natural gas and hydrogen, which are carbon emitters themselves. You didn't talk about reducing the overall production of greenhouse gas industries, just increasing efficiency. If industry grows, efficiency won't be enough to make a net difference. Where do these important concepts fit into your proposal? Ed, can you speak a little bit to those pieces?
Yes, it's a good and complicated question. The simple answer to that would be that energy efficiency is the fastest way to start. In fact, analysis have showed that energy efficiency can get us about halfway to the goals needed by the reductions by 2050. But as you point out, Maya, it's not going to be sufficient to get us all the way to the reduction goals. So that's where additional pillars need to be implemented. So the combination of the next priorities is somewhat dependent on location, resources, and others. For Louisiana, where you already have a good amount of usage of hydrogen, that hydrogen could be shifted to those renewable resources, such as hydrogen generated by electrolysis from wind or solar. But the infrastructure, is not in place for that to happen at the scale that's needed for industry at this point. And the cost is also 2 to 3 times the cost of hydrogen from a steam methane reformer. So that's an area of challenge and opportunity for policy as well. And I'll point out that although electrification is one of the pillars that needs to be pushed early on, currently the price of electricity at many locations in the country is 2 to 13 times that of natural gas. So natural gas has come up recently in cost, so that ratio will come down. But that's also an opportunity for incentives to help boost the adoption rate of electrification. So in answer to your question, I would suggest pushing energy efficiency as hard as possible early on, building the capabilities for electrification and the use of low carbon fuels. Second, and also building the capabilities for mitigation options such as CCUS. So hopefully that answered the question.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate it. I do want to mention to everyone that if we don't get to one of your questions, Lindsay will be compiling those afterwards, and we'll work on a Q&A to be sent out afterwards. So don't worry if we don't get to everything today. Let's try and do 1 or 2 more though before we jump to our next set of speakers. Question from Jeff Brown for Jeff and maybe for Ed as well about heat. The research I've seen indicates far greater need for heat above 400 C in the 600 to 1,000 range. If you need 800 C, then you later can use heat exchangers to provide low temperature steam from the same initial combustion. I think the issue is, what's the initial temperature requirement for heat? Jeff, you want to start?
Sure. So if the question is what is the temperature requirement, then we do have some data on the breakdown of heat demand by temperature. I showed a slide where I showed that for the chemicals industry in my presentation, and I do have data for other industries as well. If the question is more how to get high temperature heat, there are a variety of routes. There are electrical technologies that deliver heat at high temperatures. I mentioned 3, induction, lasers and electric arcs, which are used, for example, in electric arc furnaces, arc welding, plasma cutting. So, and then there's options like green hydrogen combustion and the hydrogen-derived fuels, not to mention bioenergy. So, so there are opportunities to get high temperature heat in decarbonized ways.
So I'll just build on Jeff's comments that it kind of depends on the industry that you're looking at. As I pointed out, the chemical industry, there's a fair amount of the low temperature process heat. So that's an early opportunity for changing out the sources for those for that low temperature heat. And I'll point out that although you could go straight away for the really high temperature heat and then cascade down through various transformers, basically, to recover the waste heat. Each time you do that, there's a certain amount of heat that's lost. And as it's more expensive to go for the really high temperature heat, that's probably not the best place to start, unless you go after where you really, really need it.
All right, I'm going to jump in because I want to squeeze in one more question before we go to our next round. Again, this is for Jeff. From Rob Burchick. Last spring, Professor Eric Larson of Princeton presented to us a report called Net Zero America, which has described coastal Louisiana as environmentally unsuitable for CCS on account of our fragile wetlands and eroding coast. The assessment was on page 185. Does this concern seem reasonable to you?
I'd like to actually hop in because we've had some correspondence with Dr. Larson and his co-author, Chris Gregg, about this very point. And we have some email correspondence that we were going to share in anticipation of the next meeting on focusing on CCS. But I'll just read a quick excerpt before sharing just to kind of address it. He says that we understand that some stakeholders have interpreted our assessment as an indication that existing emission point sources, which could potentially be decarbonized by being retrofitted with CO2 capture, may not be viable in Louisiana, and or that underground storage of CO2 in Louisiana may not be viable. This is not an accurate interpretation, but we recognize that slide 185 in our interim report may have led some stakeholders to this interpretation. And in part, that's because these facilities are already existing in Louisiana and have been permitted and are operational. So that's just a point. I'll circulate the full email after this meeting in anticipation of the next one, and perhaps we can address that comment at the next meeting. But if Jeff, you have anything additional to add, that is fine. And then lastly, I just want to recognize that for the record, Chief Sherelle Parfait Darter, excuse me, has joined the meeting, as has Jeff Schwartz. So please let the record reflect that they are in attendance. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Harry. Jeff, a quick comment.
Okay. I haven't seen that presentation, but I would say that one thing to keep in mind is whether the CO2 is being stored or used. So for example, if you're using electrolytic hydrogen in the chemicals industry, you may need some CO2 to combine with the electrolytic hydrogen to produce the output products that contain carbon atoms. So in that case, storage availability doesn't matter underground, I mean, because you're not putting it underground. As far as underground storage goes, I have never studied the capacity of storage under Louisiana. I do believe that there's a study by Rhodium Group that has, however. I don't know what they said, but I know their amount was non-zero, and that so I would say I would want to take a look at that report to see what they found, and I haven't looked into it personally.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Okay, for time reasons, we are going to move to our second panel. I know that there's more questions. There's interest in learning more about hydrogen. And as I said, if we don't get to everything today, we will do some written follow-up. I'm going to turn it back to Harry, who's going to introduce our next two speakers.
Thank you. So our next two speakers are going to do deep dives into policy approaches. We've talked a lot about some policy, but more on the how and the actual technologies and what you do on the ground. But here we're moving more to the policy realm. And so we'll start off with Rebecca Dell from ClimateWorks, and then who will be followed by Jeff Brown with Stanford University. So without any further ado, Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. And I'll just bring up my slides. Are people seeing my slides nicely?
Perfect.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. So I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this conversation, which, as the other speakers have said, is incredibly important and timely. With only 10 minutes, I am going to have to take a pretty high-level survey of some of the policy options that you may wish to consider. But I would like to reemphasize one of the points that my fellow speakers have already made, which is that we don't actually have another state or that we can point to that has done a very excellent and comprehensive review and has a comprehensive plan for their industry sector decarbonization. This is a new area which creates risks, of course, but it also creates a really important opportunity for leadership for Louisiana, which has the highest portion of industrial emissions of any state in the United States. And the reasons for that are clear. If you spend time in Louisiana, you see a lot of facilities that look like these. And these types of facilities are critical for supplying the materials and products that our economy relies on, but they also are the source of an enormous amount of greenhouse gas emissions and other local environmental impacts. So I wanted to start with just a framing comment about how the range of intervention opportunities is considerably broader than people sometimes assume. So if you think about this in terms of this very simple equation, the total greenhouse gas emissions that come from our industrial sector, that's GHG, is the product of all of the services we consume. Services are the things we want, like thermal comfort or transportation or things like that. So all of the services we consume multiplied by the number of products that you need to deliver a service, multiplied by the amount of material that you need to make a product, multiplied by the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted to make your materials. And so, of course, it's more complicated than that in the real world. There's lots of feedbacks, but this is, I think, a very helpful framework. And we tend to go immediately to that last term, the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted per unit of material. But in fact, we have intervention opportunities all the way along here. We can use precision application of things like fertilizers. We can increase the lifetime and the utilization of products. And so in so doing, get the same services that we want with a smaller number of products. We can also reduce waste in the manufacturing process, and we can have higher volumes and higher quality of recycling. So we can reduce the amount of material per product, and we can have all of the interventions that we've already been talking about that happen at the industrial facilities themselves. So I have a few buckets of policy interventions that I want to seed for you. We won't get into any of the details, but these are just a set of categories to help you think about what your options are. So the first one is to create markets for low greenhouse gas products. No one will make clean products if nobody wants to buy them. And so you can do that through direct incentives like carbon pricing or contracts for differences. Those are incentive structures where basically you use tax money to kind of pay the difference between the clean production cost and the dirty production cost as a public investment in a clean environment and in technological innovation. You can also use public procurement, and you want to design these incentives to support both current best practices like energy efficiency and also innovation. You also have options around clean product standards. So that's not just for public purchasing, that's for everybody. And that's a great place to focus on things like design for recycling in plastics, also things like material efficiency. So particularly in the built environment. You also have opportunities for informational interventions like mandatory reporting and disclosure, and voluntary standards and things like that. And I want to emphasize, we've talked a lot about the chemical industry so far today, which is appropriate in Louisiana. And the chemical industry is extremely heterogeneous, but globally, about 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions from the chemical industry come from two types of products, fertilizers and plastics. So the thing, the chemical industry can seem overwhelming, but I find it very helpful to remind myself what we're really talking about here, fertilizer and plastic. Now, in addition to creating markets, we can directly support innovation. So we need, in these high greenhouse gas sectors, both public and private investment has been very low compared to other sectors historically. So we want to both increase and realign those expenditures, which includes, historically we've had a lot of focus on energy efficiency, which is great, but we also want to be including overall environmental performance, climate performance, and other co-benefits that will be realized by local communities, by the workforce, and by society at large. And we really need to be integrating manufacturing, construction, and waste processing when we think about innovation. There's a lot of opportunities that span these things. For example, in the plastics industry, we do a very, very bad job of recovering plastics for recycling, even though they are in theory infinitely recyclable. Here in the United States, less than 10% of plastics are recovered are actually recycled at the end of life. Another thing that we need is demonstration at scale of new process technologies. There are a lot of technologies that have been languishing for decades in laboratories and small scales. There are technologies that are advancing currently in Europe and Asia, but languishing here. And this is a great opportunity for state and federal partnership, particularly because should the Build Back Better plan that's being currently debated in Congress pass, there'll be really substantial amounts of new funding available for this type of work. And Louisiana has a great opportunity in that bill. There are funds reserved for both CCS pilots and hydrogen pilots. And there are really clear opportunities for Louisiana in both of those areas. Then in addition to innovation, we need to just support deployment. And doing that will require infrastructure, technical assistance, and regulation. So climate safe heavy industry will require different infrastructure than we currently have. I'll give you an example of this. A couple of years back, I was talking to somebody at Entergy, and he told me about how they had been approached by a chemical company in Louisiana, and they said, we're putting a new process area into our facility. We're thinking of using an electric process instead of a natural gas process this time. We wanted to talk to our utility about it. And so the guys at Entergy said, okay, how much electricity are we talking about? And the chemical company said 750 megawatts. So when we call these industries energy intensive, we're not joking. That's 2 natural gas fired power stations to run one new process area at a chemical facility. And so these new electricity loads are going to require new infrastructure. We want clean electricity. We also are going to need transmission infrastructure to move that electricity around. And as my colleagues have already mentioned, we're going to have to transport and store CO2, and we're going to have infrastructure for zero carbon fuels like hydrogen, potentially others like ammonia. And so all of that is going to require new infrastructure, and states actually are the center for most of the policy around that, around utility regulation and land use planning and infrastructure funding. Also, technical assistance and regulatory requirements are really what we need to ensure best practices, both for energy efficiency and for dealing with the huge problem of methane leakage, which is an enormous amount of our contribution to the climate problem. And if we are going to use, if we're going to continue to rely on methane, either directly or through the form of converting it into hydrogen and then using that hydrogen, that only helps the climate if we can solve this leakage problem. It's a non-starter if we're going to continue to have high levels of leakage. Finally, the final set of policies that I would like to encourage you to consider is around protecting and investing in people. None of the other approaches that I've talked about will work if we don't have the right people in place to implement them, and if the people of Louisiana don't see the benefits from them in their own lives. And so we need to have a set of people-centered policies in addition to, and really at the core of, the broader policy landscape. So that means training practitioners, everybody from the building trades to, advanced engineering. It means making sure that we target underserved communities for investment, and that those communities see the benefits of that investment through, community labor agreements and things like that. Quality job creation and protecting workers' rights and safety. Those are areas where there's real shortage of enforcement in our current situation.
Rebecca, I'm going to jump in and just urge you to wrap it up. I think this might be your last slide.
This is my last slide, so we are great. So we need to properly fund workforce transitions where they're needed. And all of this requires investing in enforcement of the rules. We have much better rules on the books both in Louisiana and at the federal level than we actually realize. So in conclusion, reducing industry greenhouse gas emissions is essential for meeting Louisiana's climate goals, and a climate safe industry is both possible and affordable with the right investment and approaches. And I welcome your questions. Thank you so much for including me in this important discussion.
Thank you, Rebecca. Much appreciated. If you will stop sharing, we will turn it to Jeff Brown, who is our final speaker today.
All right. Can you guys now see?
Yep.
Okay, great. This presentation will just be slightly different because what Lindsay asked me to do is basically talk about how policies and the technologies and the economics interact. So it'll be a bit wide ranging, but I've got a lot of details and I can share the slides later. So with that, good. So here's some quick perspectives. For me, the question is, it's not now, or it's now, not later. We're not talking about what's perfect a decade from now. We need to get rid of tons now with the commercial technologies presently available, applicable to industrial conditions on the ground in Louisiana that are economic or close under current policies in Louisiana. Carbon tax would make choosing, among CCS switching and electrification irrelevant, but we don't have that. An important thing, and this was touched on earlier by Jeff Rissman, is a lot of times these three strategies overlap. So a good process for making natural gas is called auto-reforming. Well, it includes all three. Use electricity to make oxygen, with the oxygen replacing fossil fuels. You use some of the hydrogen that you've made actually to use to meet your combustion needs. So that's really fuel switching. And you capture all the CO2. So that's CCS. They're all together in this process. Another thing, we talk about electrification, and electrification is good, but until the grid's decarbonized, it doesn't really do that much good, for near-term GHG reductions. So the Louisiana power grid is about 0.6 tons per megawatt hour. And if I look at government figures for, combined heat and power, which is a big use in Louisiana factories, you make electricity and you make steam, they attribute 0.09 metric tons per megawatt hour. Okay, and it sounds ridiculous, but it's very efficient, and you can look it up. Another issue on combustion, do you want to switch fuels? Well, by my calculation, about 30% of Louisiana industrial emissions come from burning byproducts that are free: refinery fuel gas, wood, and catalyst regenerators. So it's hard to beat free. What policy can you make up that beats free? Retrofit versus new. If you want to take action soon, carbon capture is a bolt-on fix. You can do it after the fact. Electrification or fuel switching, like using electricity and steam methane reforming, what's hard to do if you've already got a big air products plant and it's running. And size. And CCS is better for large emitters, but there's a lot of emitters that are small. And for many of those, electrification is going to be much easier. Going on, this is similar to what other people showed. I'm working on this now for Environmental Defense Fund. But what I did was categorize Louisiana emissions. The colors on this, so left bar is the size, metric tons a year. So say refining is about 32 million tons. But I broke it as between the industry-specific emissions, which are orange, and process heat. And you can see kind of the ratio between heat and the industry-specific emissions is very different in different industries. And in some industries like pulp and paper, there's massive biogenic emissions, which are ripe for doing carbon capture. But the key thing is just how different each of these industries is. And if you look at far right, say natural gas transmission, well, there's a great place for drop-in use of electricity. Run your compressors with electricity instead of burning natural gas. Carbon capture and storage. My short version is probably works for a lot of Louisiana emissions, but about 50% look close to feasible. And a reminder that in the absence of EOR, we totally depend on government subsidies. And I provided this for everybody, but if you look in the far right, what it shows is for a very tiny slice, 3 million tons a year, we're profitable. Like minus $24 means that's a negative cost or a revenue, right? And for a big chunk of things, about 26 million tons a year, we're probably right on the margin, including steam methane reformers, cat crackers in oil refineries, and pulp mill black liquor. I think those are the best near-term candidates. And for some things, process heat, most of that is natural gas. It's so dilute that it's hard to do carbon capture without a stronger federal incentive. Just to touch on state incentives, the two big things: reduce risk, especially on siting pipelines and wells. And working for the Carbon Capture Coalition, we did a pretty major report on the impact of state taxes. And state taxes can really play a big role in carbon capture feasibility, especially property tax on the equipment and sales tax on the equipment. I wanted to touch on, just with the last couple of minutes here, on some details on fuel switching, because everybody talks about fuel switching. But Louisiana, I think uniquely in industry, is already using very low carbon fuels. The only thing you can do better with is hydrogen. So 97% of Louisiana industrial fuel use, and this is EPA numbers, is natural gas and refinery fuel gas. And by the way, the refinery fuel gas is free. If you want to replace natural gas with hydrogen, blue hydrogen with carbon capture probably quadruples your cost, and green hydrogen that's probably more like 16-fold. And I gave you a reference to Julio Friedman's numbers. Very little pet coke, almost no oil, no coal. The last thing I wanted to talk about machinery. There's two parts of electrification in my view. There's machinery, replacing compressors and pumps. That's a great opportunity in the long run. The electricity is expensive though, because a lot of these compressors are driven by gas that's already in the pipeline, and you just use it and the customers lose it. That's how pipelines work. And a lot of the compressors are new, like those at Cheniere. It's going to be hard to convince Cheniere to throw out all their compressors that emit about 5 million tons a year and replace them with electric compressors. I did want to talk a little bit about process heat. This is why I asked the question earlier. McKinsey set out a report, and these are just two quick comments, and I'll wrap up, Lindsay, on process heat. They said half of fuel consumed for energy can be electrified. But this key thing, and if you guys can see where I have this lower X, 400 to 1,000 degree heat, they say it's available today. And then they go on to say technology is feasible, but not yet commercially available for all applications. What that really means is a lot of electrification, like electrifying steam methane reformers. Yeah, we're working on it and it is great. And I love it. And I would like to do one of those projects, but haven't seen it yet. This is the last one. And I think this is a bit of a killer. McKinsey did this conclusion that all you needed was $20 power prices, and you could replace this key slug of high temperature heat required, 400 to 1,000 degrees. And they said, yeah, as long as gas prices are $7 and power prices are $20, that works. Okay. Well, the only trouble is, forget $20, Louisiana industrial power prices are 60, so 3 times higher. Meanwhile, Louisiana industrial gas costs are $3.68 versus $7. So McKinsey, this is great. Hooray, we can replace all these electric process heat needs with electricity if we just change market prices by 600%. So as I said, off by 600%, nice chart. So that is a quick, as they say, Cook's tour of the policies and the technology, and obviously more questions, and I'm happy to provide slides later.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. Great job keeping us on time here. We do have a few questions in the chat. I'm actually going to ask the folks who put their questions in to come off of mute and pose their question. And again, we'll get to some of these, probably not to all of them. But as Lindsay noted, we will do a follow-up Q&A document that will be publicly available. So Camille, if you would come off of mute and share your question, please.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Heidi. Dr. Cletus mentioned the 10-year time frame for meaningful action to ward off the worst of climate impacts. And I'm trying to understand the time frame of all the technology that's just been discussed. And so there's been a lot of talk about hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and then somewhat on renewables. What's the relative time frame for each of these to be deployed at scale, and what are the human safety and well-being considerations that we need to understand?
Could I do a quick answer there?
Sure, Jeff.
It's on CCS. And I'm a blunt person. There's a lot of foolishness about the technology of CCS. So take steam methane reformers. The companies that operate steam methane reformers to make hydrogen, say, for refining, it's big and scary. Within the fertilizer industry, virtually every fertilizer plant in the world already has carbon capture. A company named BASF, chemical company, provides about 75% of it. They use amines, the same chemicals. And why do they do it? Because they need to take CO2 captured in steam methane reforming. They later in the process add it to ammonia to make urea. Okay, so it's absolutely, totally common in the ammonia industry, but everybody makes a big deal about it in the hydrogen industry when it's the same damn machines. So that's just an example of where there's, a lot of misinformation about the technology. Other stuff like electrification is easily available now, right? I talked about, say, the example of Cheniere, which emits about 5 million tons a year. Of that, about 80% is compressors and refrigerators that are simply run by burning natural gas. The technology is easy. You can replace all that stuff with electrical equipment immediately. There's no safety impact. It's a matter of you have to talk them into scrapping their machines, putting in electric ones, and you have to talk them into paying basically, retail industrial rates for electric power instead of basically just poaching some of their natural gas that's on site and using it. So we don't have technology needs or concerns. We have economic and techno-economic needs and a little bit of need for less obfuscation by the part of industries that don't want to clean up their act.
Just if I could add briefly to that, I think the next 10 years are crucial and we're going to have to keep cutting emissions beyond that. So it's really important that we not get ourselves in dead end situations where we're simply slapping on band-aids that might help in the near term, but lock us into fossil intensive infrastructure over the longer term. So some of these technologies are no doubt going to be necessary. But the core of this transition is going to have to be getting off fossil fuels as much as possible. We have to keep sight of that because if we make a lot of investments up front, assuming that we can continue business as usual fossil fuel use, we're missing the big climate science point here, which is that we have to get to net zero by 2050, if not before. And yes, there are these technologies like hydrogen, like CCUS that could play a niche role, but let's be clear about the main thrust of our focus and our investments so that they serve well over the long term. And by this, not just from a climate perspective, but also the other emissions and pollution that are associated with fossil fuel use, the particulate matter, the toxic pollution, making sure that we're not just slipping on end of pipeline technologies that don't address these other big public health concerns. So you all are grappling with a very, very tough problem and transition, no doubt. But even so, especially because of that, making dead end investments needs to be clearly examined at the front end before assuming these magic bullet type of solutions.
Hey, Rachel, I'd just like to respond quickly. Take the pulp and paper industry. Both of the things you mentioned, I believe, could be disputed. First, pulp and paper industry. You cannot replace toilet paper and paper towels with solar power. You have to use trees to get cellulose. And there's 6 million tons of biogenic emissions in Louisiana to which carbon capture could be applied. The second thing, if you talk about pollution and social justice, paper mills in Louisiana emit tons of particulate and sulfur and NOx. Certainly, virtually all of the sulfur and most of the particulate would have to be removed in order to apply carbon capture. So there is a nexus and a co-benefit between carbon capture systems and CCS. So, I don't think if we do, carbon capture on a pulp mill, we're not locking ourselves into fossil energy, sorry.
Yeah, no doubt. I'm not suggesting across the board a black and white response here. I am suggesting that we be intentional. And there's a lot of hype about hydrogen. If that hydrogen is coming from fossil fuels, we're actually losing the benefit of it being a truly transition to clean energy. So again, there's been a lot of obfuscation about what are we talking about when we use terms like hydrogen economy. It's really, really important to look beneath the hood and see where is that hydrogen being produced from? What are the carbon emissions implications of that front end production as we're thinking about its use in the industry. And there are no doubt industries where some of these technologies can and will be used to good benefit. Just trying to make sure that it doesn't become this overarching, that's going to save us. We're going to do that thing and we don't have to wrestle with the fundamental challenge that we still have.
All right.
So this is
I'm gonna keep us moving here so we get to a couple other questions. Ed, did you want to weigh in quickly on this?
Just real quick, economics is super important. So is location. So in Louisiana, there may be avenues for decarbonization that are different than other regions of the country. So consider that, and also think about the fact that although we talk about the innovations in this space, it's also important to think about process innovation so that things are made differently with lower carbon sources of their carbon and the energy that's used.
All right, thank you, good context. Rob Verchick, do you want to come up and mute and pose your question?
Yes, thank you.
Did Rebecca have a question?
I'll just say slide 5 lists some of the costs associated with CCS, which I appreciate, but it leaves out costs associated with leaks, health and environmental effects from pipeline construction, contamination of drinking water, seismic activity, asphyxiation from livestock and humans. Though elsewhere you say in the slides that it's important for the state to assume the costs of those risks, which assumes, at least suggests to me that they're non-trivial. So I guess I'm wondering, as an economist, what's your estimate of the value per ton of these long tail risks? And why should the state assume the risks when industry, it would appear, has more knowledge about those risks and also more control over the activities that produce them?
Well, that's a huge question, but just to take a couple of snapshots, for instance, the pipeline, toxicity, there's never been a death associated with the CO2 pipeline in the US. Just can't find one. If you take the seismicity, that's why Class 6 permits are critical. And Louisiana has a process for reviewing that. If you inject stuff into the underground, you have to not break the underground. That's the same as, any subsurface process. It's difficult. And when you talk about, there was in my slide, I said, long tail liabilities. The issue is once you completely stopped injecting and you have shown that there's no leaks and the site is stable, the question is whether the person injecting has to be on the hook for the next 100 years. That's what California decided. They decided the person injecting has to be on the hook for the next 100 years because 100 years was the time frame used in carbon allowances in tropical forestry. That was the time frame. It had nothing to do with the actual risks in carbon capture, and so you just got to.
So just to be clear, you're not. This is good. So you're not suggesting that the state should absolve industry of liability for asphyxiations, explosions, seismic activities, any harm done to the environment. You're not suggesting that the industry should be absolved of any responsibility for that.
No, hell no. I'm just talking about 100-year post-closure liabilities when there's no known liability. But as somebody in California pointed out, if we apply your standards and time frame, that's comparable to something like I think they said the Ulysses S. Grant administration versus today. Okay, well that's silly.
All right, let's try to do one more and then we are going to take a break. Alexander Kolker, you had a question. Do you want to come off of mute and ask it?
Heidi, Alex is not on the task force itself. So as I mentioned in the chat and we talked about at the beginning of the meeting, we'll prioritize questions from the task force in the short Q&A, and then anyone else who has questions, we'll make sure they're addressed in that FAQ.
Of course, makes total sense.
May I, this is Virginia Burkett, a member of the task force, and if it's possible, I would really like to have Alex either I would encourage Alex to, on my behalf, to ask that question, and is a member of the Science Advisory Group.
All right, Virginia, since that is something of interest to you, I will read the question. It's about hydrogen reforming. According to U.S. Department of Energy, steam methane reforming takes place at 700 to 1,000. In your view, what is the source of energy to generate this heat?
If the question is about current practice without, I believe that the natural gas combustion, they have natural gas that they're using for steam methane reforming to get the hydrogen, and also they will burn some to generate the heat. If the question is how could you generate the heat through a zero carbon process, the main options would be blue hydrogens. So you capture the CO2 from the methane, and the other option would be to use electricity. So some of the electrical technologies, like those I previously discussed, can reach 700 to 1,000 C.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, with that, we're a little bit over, so we are going to take a pause. We were going to take a 15-minute break. I propose that we limit it to 10, so we have maximum time for discussion. Our panelists will be sticking around, I understand, so they will be available if we want to call on them, but we really are hoping to have discussion between and amongst the task force members when we come back from break. I have 10:39, 10:40. Let's plan to come back at 10:50. I'll see everyone in 10 minutes. Welcome back to those who you have joined. We still have a lot of folks that I don't think are back yet, so we'll give it just a minute. If folks can turn on their cameras as they come back, even if it's just briefly, that'd be great. That lets me know that you're here. Thank you. All right, I think we have most folks back, so I think we should go ahead. I do want to mention that over the course of the break, there was some more dialogue going on in the chat, and some of our speakers from this morning did provide some answers to questions in there. So do take a look at that if you have time. We'll be saving everything, of course, so don't worry, nothing will get lost. So we are going to transition now and really try and have some conversation. And I'm going to just do a little bit of lead in and then pose some questions to all of you. So the task force has been meeting for quite some time now, and you've really learned about how transformational change is necessary to achieve the goals that you've been tasked with tackling. The speed and the scale required present big challenges. And requiring thinking about how to maximize benefits and also how to minimize harm. So today, we really want you to sort of put on a hat where you're thinking about common interests and what's really required to achieve all of the objectives that you have identified as a task force. Goals that relate to people and equity, goals related to a strong economy, and goals related to resilient natural resources. We're going to have 2 discussion questions. We'll take about 20 minutes for each of them. We really want to try and get as many thoughts and hear from as many of you as we can. And so because of that, we want to follow a process where I'll ask a question and I'll ask everyone to take a minute or 2 and just think about it and think about how you would answer that question. And then after you've had a minute to think, then I'm going to ask everyone to put some initial thoughts into the chat, so that we make sure we hear from everyone. And then we'll ask people who want to share verbally to come off mute and talk a little bit. But again, I'll ask the question, ask you all to just take a minute and think about it. And we do that because if we jump right in, we tend to feed off of whatever gets said first. This way, we really get everyone's thoughts. So our first question for today is, how can we help our economy stay robust through the transition we know is needed and coming, but also take advantage of that transition to help our people and communities achieve a better quality of life? So again, just take a minute. You can jot down some notes, or if you want to type in the chat, but not hit enter just yet. We'll start sharing in just a minute or 2.
Heidi, can you repeat the question again, please?
Of course. How can we help our economy stay robust through the transition we know is needed and coming, but also take advantage of that transition to help our people and communities achieve a better quality of life? All right, I see some folks are still jotting down some things, but a lot of folks look like they're ready to share. So please put some thoughts into the chat about how we can find that balance and get benefits while also keeping our economy robust. And I'm gonna give it a minute to let everybody type their thoughts in and enter those in chat. and then I'll ask who wants to come off of mute and do some sharing. Thank you, Terrence. All right, starting to see some ideas come in. All right, I'm not sure if y'all are typing or you're shy. All right, I do see that some folks are still typing, so please do put your thoughts in chat, and we want to do that just so we make sure that we really do get to hear from everybody on this question. But let's have some dialogue. If you would raise your hand for me, that'll help me moderate and know who wants to speak. Harry.
Yeah, so I'll kick us off. Well, first, I'd just like to thank all of our speakers today for really putting in the time and effort to give us a thorough education, I think, on the industrial sector and particularly a look at Louisiana specific aspects of decarbonizing the industrial sector. And certainly I need to go back and review it. These were pretty detailed, content-rich slides, but I would say that my takeaway was that we need to embrace these 4 pillars or multiple pillars approach, and that we can't just put all our eggs in one basket, and that we need to move forward in investment, in workforce training, in fair policy and good public policy to move these things forward in a way that not only promotes our economy and promotes job growth and job diversification, but also can improve our public health and our environment at the same time.
Thanks, Harry. Appreciate those reflections. Many of you are now weighing in by chat. Thank you for that. So we make sure we hear from everyone. Who else would like to chat a little bit?
Hey, Heidi, this is Tyler Gray.
Sure.
The only comment that I'd like to make is, I just think that as we go through all this, it's important to be realistic and consider all of Louisiana's needs, whether it's demand, efficiency, the available technology, especially when we're making policy decisions. It's just going to be important that when we are making decisions that we just have as much information as we can. And so we appreciate breaking this into multiple meetings, right? Knowing that it takes a long time to get a full perspective, but I just think it's being realistic is going to be really important as part of this discussion.
Thanks, Tyler. Flozell.
Great, thanks, Heidi. I appreciate it. I really appreciate the speakers and the presenters today. I'm thinking about this question you posed, right? And so one, I want to call into question actually whether our economy is currently robust. So I think there's some conversation that we should have. One of the great things about this task force has been having the equity working group, the economic opportunity working group, the legal and the science. We've been getting really good information in some ways of interrogating what our normal framework is. And so pursuant to that, I think there's such an enormous opportunity based on what we've seen in the greenhouse gas inventory, what's been presented today, and other discussions that have been had to see sort of renewables and the opportunity to move in that direction. And I know we have some policy differences as well as some further analysis. I think there's an opportunity to make this transition as a way of building a robust economy and to build a forward-looking economy. There have been a few comments in the chat that show the same thing. And those of us who travel around the state and talk to our neighbors about what they want to see, even people who currently work in these industries, they're very interested in future economies that are not only going to allow them to take care of their families, but they're also interested in being able to be trained to transition to renewable economies and low carbon or no carbon economies that are also going to make them proud to do this work and save not only the earth and whatever our contribution is to that, but specifically save Louisiana for future generations so that their grandchildren can be here and can be prosperous. And so looking at massive federal incentives, we've done this before in this country when we've had to make large economic transitions. We need federal assistance that is sort of man to the moon. We need cooperation at the state level, both from a policy perspective as well as where we decide to incentivize the economic parts of that transition. And then we are going to have to really tell the truth about what it means to get to 2030 and 2050 goals here. For us to get anywhere near a robust economy that I would again argue the data shows we currently do not have, we are going to have to figure out how to stop current emissions. I know that's a controversial and sort of big thing to talk about, but the science and the data are not telling us anything different. I'm not debating opinions here. I think I'm sort of looking at the data and the facts, and I'm hoping we can continue to do that.
Thank you very much. Eric.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Yes, the one thing I wanted to say is, over the next 10 years, I think Dr. Ryder was correct. I hope I pronounced his name correctly, but we've got to focus on efficiency. That's the quickest, easiest thing to do, that you can make major improvements just by that. And it fits into something that most of us were taught from a young age. It's an old cliche about waste not, want not. So if just because you have resources, if you waste them, you're going to come up short. So in all aspects of life and our economy, we should be trying to conserve, and energy is one of those things we ought to be trying to conserve. So that's where I think our biggest win is going to be, particularly over the next 10 years, because the infrastructure to do other things is not there. The technology is not there yet. The infrastructure is not there yet. So I believe that's really got to be our initial focus, is on efficiency, trying to get more energy efficiency in all aspects of our economy, including industry, and that should help keep costs under control as well. Hopefully it'll be cost beneficial to a lot of industries, and that will keep costs to our residents down as well, their energy costs down, their product costs down, because if you go in the other direction, you could drive inflation, and that's going to hurt low income people the most. So anyway, that's my point of view. So thank you.
Thanks, Eric. I appreciate it. Camille.
Yeah, I'll read my statement and elaborate some, since not everyone can see the statements that we're all putting in the chat. We're going to have to take a multi-pronged approach, and I think we're on the right track of doing that, of having a whole of government response, but addressing several priorities in a manner that identifies the strategies to deliver multiple benefits for our environment, our economy, public health, equity, and resilience. Back getting to what Flozell was mentioning. But I think what's really going to be critical here is we need to have the courage and wherewithal to embrace new and safe technologies for clean industry, invest in building the people infrastructure and policies we need to be successful in building out an economy around them. And at the same time, we need to change the way we've traditionally done economic development in the state to ensure that as we shift to a new economy, we're leveraging opportunities to address the deeply entrenched poverty in the state. I take issue with Jeff's comments around taxing through property taxes to pay for our carbon reduction. The poverty levels and they increase every time we have a disaster. So, I don't see that as a viable option. However, looking to the bright side, I think with a vision, the climate action plan that this group is putting together, which needs to be followed by intentional action and implementation, we can harness the power of ingenuity and innovation to transition. And, to Dr. Cletus's point, we have to take meaningful change in the next 10 years, and how we get there really matters. And so this is an opportunity not just to secure our climate future, but to turn the tide on equity and quality of life for everyone in Louisiana.
Could I do a short response?
Just 1 second, Jeff. Let me check with, we do have one other task force member with his hand up. And Eric, is your hand up because you wanted to speak again? Or is it just a remnant?
I thought I'd lowered it. I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries, no worries. Jeff, briefly, please.
No, Camille, sorry, I probably misled you. What I was suggesting is that in most states, including some laws on the books in Louisiana, if you install a pollution control device, you do not pay sales tax when you buy the equipment. And when you install it, you're eligible for a tax holiday from local taxes. So that's on the books for pollution control devices. But in many states, CO2 is not legally treated as pollution. And so the question is literally, what is the statutory definition of pollution in Louisiana? So I was not suggesting taxing poor people to buy some pollution control equipment for Exxon. That would be terrible, and I agree with you.
Thanks, Jeff. Others who want to weigh in? Rob.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. Here, I'm going to go. I'm low on bandwidth, but let me see. I'll go on the camera. I'm concerned that we don't talk enough on the task force about real ways to reduce production, emissions, and by that also steering demand toward other products that would be less carbon intensive. Like many of us on the task force, I look at all these pathway studies, from wherever they come from, and I don't see any scenario anywhere where we could reduce emissions without dramatically reducing production. And whether that means limiting permits in some way, or whatever else. We could do it through a cap on carbon, I suppose, in an indirect way. Or we could do it with a price on carbon. But even in our portfolio that we've been evaluating, There's some vague talk about things that might conceivably reduce production, but we're not talking specifically about it. And so I think we either need to talk specifically about it and embrace it, or talk specifically about it and explain why we're rejecting that, and explain how we can. Not a very good option.
Rob, you were cutting in and out just a little bit. Would you try again to say just your last point?
Yes, I think the most important thing is to, I'm talking louder because I think that's going to solve the problem. I think the most important thing is that we identify that issue and resolve it one way or the other. Either we're going to reduce production and come up with ideas to do it, or
all right, Rob is clearly having some bandwidth issues.
And how we plan to get to net zero with reducing. We're not talking about it.
All right.
Hey, Rob.
Rob, I'm gonna stop you because you're cutting in and out for us. I might ask you to throw a thought into the chat, but I think we got the gist. Is that we really need to focus in on this issue of, are we going to reduce production, right? So thank you for raising that, and that's good fodder for us.
This is
Harry.
Yeah, maybe kind of like to address that a little bit. And so reducing production, I think that's a fairly vague term, and I think we want to be cognizant of not reducing production here, but just increasing production of whatever material or product elsewhere, recognizing that this is a global issue. And so I think reducing production of carbon intensive materials is something that we've heard about, from the presenters, as well as energy, or as well as efficiency and reducing waste. And so, thinking about, one way of doing that, and let's try and drill down to a more specific is, we've heard a lot about, fertilizer is a big component of the, chemical pie chart in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We recognize that we have a nutrient issue in the Mississippi River watershed, and that creates a dead zone. So, is that a potential tie-in where you're, let's say, investing in precision irrigation and precision application of fertilizers in the Midwest could then therefore reduce overall need for, reduce waste of fertilizers, and thereby reduce that kind of global impact and footprint, and therefore also achieve some of these benefits of improving water quality by reducing runoff. So anyway, I was trying to find an example of what you're talking, kind of more in the specific of, where you're looking elsewhere at the use side and the demand side, and thinking about either reducing waste or switching to low carbon intensive materials.
Thanks, Harry. Yeah, having those actual examples, right, I think are super helpful, for sure. All right, anyone else want to weigh in before we go to our second question? All right, I don't see hands up. So just so you know, I have to page through 3 screens to check if anyone's hand is up. So it takes me a minute. I am going to turn us to our second question. And as before, I'm going to read the question and ask you all to think about it for just a minute. And then we'll start sharing via chat and coming off mute and talking as well. So our second question is, how does what we heard today, so everything you heard from our speakers and our conversation, refine, challenge, or change your thinking about the existing actions being considered by the task force? And I know you guys have quite a portfolio of potential actions, but we're asking you to reflect a little bit on how what you heard today may have changed your thinking about any of those. And if you want to suggest some refinement. So take a minute and think about the question, and then we'll start sharing in just a minute. Okay, as we did before, I will ask everyone, if you would, share your thoughts about this in the chat, so that we are capturing as many ideas as we can. But let's go ahead and also go to some conversation. Who would like to talk a little bit about how today's content may have spurred some thinking about some of the actions? Harry.
Because there was some silence, but yeah, I really appreciated the nuanced conversation about industrial electrification. I mean, nuanced conversation across the board, but that's something that I hadn't known too much about, and sort of the varying degrees of technological readiness, which was helpful to understand and kind of think through. I believe it was also on Jeff Brown's slides that, kind of the recognizing that sort of a gap, in the federal incentive, for industrial electrification, and sort of, is that a gap that should be filled or pursued, or is something that now I'm starting to think about. So I appreciate those insights from the panel.
Thanks, Harry. Yeah, that was exactly the intent of today, is to inspire thinking like that. Eric.
Yes, thank you. Well, just to reiterate what my earlier comments, I don't think we focused enough on efficiency, particularly in the short term. I think that was missing out of our action portfolio. The other thing too, there was a lot of discussion about hydrogen, some about biofuels, and that was all but ignored in our recommendations, our action portfolio. So I think we need to focus more on those. I think we have with this state, with the environment we have here, we can produce a lot of biofuels and provide a lot of jobs for our citizens in this state with that. And the other thing too that has largely been ignored both today and in the action portfolio is nuclear power. That's a clean way to produce electricity from a climate change standpoint. So, but there's no emphasis on that. And most of us that live in Baton Rouge, we've been using nuclear power for 40 years from the facility up there just south of St. Francisville. So anyway, those are my comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Lizelle, I might ask you to come off of mute and share your comments, since you wanted to get the group thinking about something specific.
Well, I'm just wondering, Heidi, as I listen to the presentations and this discussion, and I do want to come back to Eric, because I really agree with him on the efficiencies. I just have some questions about the industrial scale. So maybe later we can talk about that. But I'm really trying to figure out, as a layperson, I'm not a scientist, nor am I a lawyer. How do we measure each recommendation for its impact as much as we can against our greenhouse gas emissions, in addition to the very relevant quality of life impacts that have been mentioned by Colette and Camille and others, so that we can have a cleaner way to address whether something is a really good idea and we should put some energy into it, or, no pun intended, or whether something's just not going to get us there and we should move away from putting resources into trying to develop strategies to get us there. And so I don't know if there's some matrix we can design or some apparatus or mechanism that gets us to, taking the greenhouse gas inventory, taking the other points of science and law and equity and social impact, and sort of putting it into a machine, if you will. I know it's not that simple and requires some nuance and subjectivity. But we should start to think about what does that look like, so we can have, I think, more efficient and effective ways of analyzing this, and so that we can call the question on things that just are not going to actually work. I think we're at the point in the task force where we need to start with.
Okay, thank you. Really, really important concept. And Jeff Risman wants to weigh in about this.
I wanted to mention that Mr. Daniels' comment is the perfect segue into the reminder that the Louisiana Energy Policy Simulator will be launching in a week or so. And it is a tool that has had years of development effort behind it, including the core structure and programming, and aims to try to do exactly that. So it has outputs about how much each policy measure would lower emissions, not just of greenhouse gases, but also of other pollutants that harm local health. It has outputs on impacts on GDP and jobs and costs. It even has estimates of avoided premature mortality and other health outcomes. So while there's no perfect way to see the future, this tool is probably going to be of great interest to you, because it's one of the most sophisticated attempts to estimate these sorts of things.
Thanks for that reminder, Jeff.
Indeed, thanks.
And Flozell, I would just add on that before handing it over to Eric, that our October 26th task force meeting, we will be modeling for you all how the draft portfolio does reduce our emissions, and breaking that down a little bit by the different sections of the portfolio, alongside the advisory group feedback, kind of like we did in the June meeting. So we'll bring that down to what we've developed so far too. Thanks, Jeff.
Lindsay. So Eric and Harry, you both have your hands up. Eric, I'm not sure if yours is a new hand.
No, it is a new hand. And
Okay.
I just wanted to follow up on what Flozell said, because I think he's right. But the thing we have to look at too, and one thing we've never had is, we've never built our things around any kind of budgets. And, if we're going to try to achieve change through, whether that's through tax incentives or public expenditures or whatever, you got to look at what are you getting for the amount of money you're spending, whether you're giving tax breaks or you're using public funds for expenditures. And I'll give you a good example of one of our actions, which I'm very supportive of, is to convert the public fleet of vehicles to alternative fuels. Well, each of us, I work for a government agency, as some of the others do too. And yeah, we have a budget for some vehicle replacements every year, but the scale we're talking about, it's going to require more money than we have available. And so we've never really talked about the cost of these things. If we're going to try to incentivize industry to make certain changes through tax incentives or what have you, and there was discussion about the federal tax incentive for reducing CO2 emissions, we never really built things around any kind of budgets. And that's something we have to consider, I think, when we put together our list of recommendations. Under this budget scenario, we can achieve this. Under this budget scenario, we can achieve that. And maybe build our action portfolio on those terms. So thank you.
Okay, good concept. Thanks, Eric. Harry, and then Jeff.
Yeah, and thanks for those comments, Eric. And I think that that is something that we'll certainly need to do, and whether we can get it into the next few months, because I mean that kind of basically building a fiscal note. If we're talking about any legislation, that would certainly need to be done before or in anticipation of any proposed package. So certainly something that needs to go factor into the equation. I just wanted to, I guess, while we had our experts still on, or at least some of them still on the Zoom, if they had any, I saw a lot of heads nodding up and down when folks have been talking about energy efficiency or efficiency generally. Are there best practices that you think on a state level work very well that you've seen work in other jurisdictions, or I mean any other level, but something that you think that Louisiana and the members of this task force should really look into and consider as we look to refine our climate action plan?
Okay, I can tell that several folks want to answer this one, but we'll start with Jeff since his hand is up first.
Yep. I was going to say, and even in my conclusions, I said, beyond these three, you would start with conservation. The trouble is, right, what we're faced with in most states is, since we don't have a carbon tax, everything's skewed, right? You do what is the lowest net cost, taking account of the federal incentives and state incentives that now exist. And so, for instance, that tends to skew things towards carbon capture. Something that a state like Louisiana can do is definitely use the electric regulatory process to approve conservation or demand side management investments. And I just want to give you guys an amusing example. In California, they have things with no price on the menu. So they force utilities to buy back solar even when they don't need it. And even the state calculates this at about $1,200 per ton of CO2 avoided. That's a requirement to the utilities, but there's no price on it. Meanwhile, the PUC, the regulator at the same time, measures the benefits of utility paid for savings of conservation or demand side management. They evaluate it in a cost benefit analysis versus the current trading price of CO2 in California, which at times has been like $12. So you have the paradoxical bad policy of you're doing like $1,200 tons and you're disapproving $12 tons. So, off by a factor of 100. So a little bit, what I'm saying is the state can really, really work to make electric utility side conservation investments, including industrial electrification, work under the regulatory scheme.
Okay, thanks for that illustrative example. Rebecca and Rachel, I know you both want to chime in. Maybe we'll start with Rebecca.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so I think that efficiency is an excellent option. As many people have pointed out, it's not going to get us all the way there, but it is a great thing we can do right away. And actually, there is some evidence that of all of the major heavy industries in the United States, the chemical industry is the one where there's the most room for improvement in this space. So it could be particularly relevant in Louisiana. So the kind of efficiency incentives that Jeff was talking about, I think are that can be done through the public utility regulatory process are really important. But I wanted to add a note of caution to that, which is that if those incentives and those programs are not well designed, what they can end up doing is basically you incentivize the utility to just reduce the total amount of electricity that they sell. And that's actually the opposite of what we want to do, because in the long term, we want more of our economy to be using electricity, using clean electricity as the primary energy source. And so we have to make sure that while we are incentivizing efficiency, we are not disincentivizing beneficial electrification. And then I would also add to this that particularly for small and medium enterprises, technical assistance can have huge social returns on investment. A relatively small amount of money spent by the state on providing technical assistance, particularly for small and medium enterprises, can make a huge difference, because Dow Chemicals has an entire staff of engineers whose whole job is to think about energy efficiency, but smaller companies do not.
Thanks, Rebecca. Really good points. Be very thoughtful about your policy design, right? And technical assistance can go a long way with some entities. Great points. Rachel.
Yeah, I just want to start by emphasizing the point that Rebecca made about electrification. We no longer have the time or the luxury from a climate perspective to go stepwise. We have to go all in together, and we have to be maxing out on efficiency and beneficial electrification at the same time. So our power sector has to become the linchpin. A clean, renewable energy powered power sector becomes the linchpin for the rest of the economy to decarbonize. I want to also emphasize the need to bundle efficiency in a way that really serves the needs of end users, consumers of electricity, in addition to the industrial users that we're talking about here, ensuring that it is delivering lower rates to customers, better reliability, really an attention to what's happening with these power outages as climate extremes worsen. And in the state of Louisiana, I think the return on investment, the benefit proposition here is to be thinking about climate resilience and efficiency at the same time. Whether we're thinking about housing or whether we're thinking about incentives for utilities, et cetera, we really have to be thinking about the fact that we don't just want to build infrastructure that's low carbon, but infrastructure that's also going to be climate resilient in the face of the impacts that Louisiana is already seeing.
Thanks, Rachel. Excellent points. Don't see an immediate hand. I might ask Bill Robertson. Bill, if you want to come off of mute, you had offered to weigh in from the political science perspective on all of this. Do you have some comments you wanted to share?
Not sure. I've been typing out some comments about the electric companies because I just spent 18 years with the state regulatory body. And my comments were that Hurricane Ida has kicked off a discussion about the electric companies. Were they resilient enough? Should we have more choices, et cetera? And I'm just wondering, since electrification appears to be a big part of the solution to climate change, do we need to increase choices in our state with regard to where you get your electricity, the nature of it, et cetera? I know that cogeneration and combined heat and power appear to be efficient, and they appeal to me because they provide some resilience for the heavy industry. And I'm for jobs, and I'm for people having jobs, and I'm for our industry to be clean and efficient. So I guess I could put the question, for example, to our friend in Stanford, if he's still on. California deregulated electricity some years ago, and it appeared to have been kind of a debacle, but I don't know if they reversed all of that. Texas deregulated electricity as well, and Texas industry has a lot of choices now on where they get their power. So this is a debate that primarily takes place inside the regulatory world and is not broader, so it can get real complicated, but I'm just throwing that out there to see if anybody has any comment.
Thanks, Bill. Any quick responses on that one? We are just about out of time. All right, well, we will have to have that for future conversation. I do want to hold true to wrapping up at this point so that we can get to the public comment period. Thank you all so much for your thoughts. We will be continuing this conversation during our second session on industrial decarbonization, so I will look forward to that. And I will turn it back to Harry.
Thank you, Heidi. And once again, I just want to thank all our speakers for preparing such thought-provoking and informative presentations, and being with us and sharing their time with us today is tremendously helpful. I also want to thank you again for agreeing to assist on our FAQ to get to some of the questions that we didn't have time to get to today. And so just as a reminder to our task force members and the public, we'll be working with our speakers on that, and we'll look to get that out as soon as we are able to within reason. And so with that, we will move into our public comment period. And so we've been accepting public comments via the climate@la.gov email, and Lindsay will check that and will be reading out the senders, those who have submitted, and then we will append the actual comments to the record like we did last meeting, just in the interest of time, as well as in the interest of time, we are going to limit the verbal comments to 3 minutes, just so we can get to everybody's comments. I know in the meetings past, we've had a tremendous amount of input, which is fantastic, but we want to make sure that those at the back of the line are able to provide their comments in a timely manner and not to have to stay overtime to make those. And so with that, I think we'll take the, if anybody has a comment who is attending this Zoom, you can, I believe, raise your hand, and Lindsay will promote you to speak your comment. I believe Jane Patton.
Yes, thank you. Zoom made me sign back in order for you to be able to see my camera, so it took an extra second. First, I want to sincerely thank you all for your close examination of this issue and for holding these meetings on industrial decarbonization. It's much needed, and it's obviously a key learning process for all of us that are engaged and invested in a secure and just future for Louisiana need to be going through together. Many of us in this conversation were displaced during the originally scheduled time for this meeting, in hotel rooms or families' homes across the state and the wider South, watching Ida with trepidation. Many of us have had to undergo repairs, some massive, on our homes since the storm, or have helped others with repair or care following the storm's damage. With that financial and economic stress in mind, I want to build on something that Mr. Daniels said earlier. Louisiana does not currently have a robust economy. Our state has 4.5 million people, and we have the second highest child poverty rate in the nation. We have the 14th most unfair tax structure in the country. New Orleans and Baton Rouge had the second highest mortgage deferral rates in the country during the pandemic, a bill which came due painfully and suddenly last month. And even in hurricane recovery, FEMA consistently gives more disaster relief to white people than to Black or Indigenous people. Where is the robust economy here? And in the midst of all this, we have a Department of Environmental Quality that routinely and as a matter of agency policy adjusts permits to allow for higher emissions instead of holding polluters accountable. We have approved or are in the process of approving from new facility construction an additional 126 million tons per year of greenhouse gas emissions per year. Over the last 10 years, as greenhouse gas emissions in Louisiana have consistently gone up, tax breaks, incentives, and grants to the industry have also gone up, while our people have suffered, and suffered in a way that is inherently racist. The ultimate concrete action that we need to take to protect Louisiana and its people is not mere decarbonization of industry or anything else. We need to reduce or halt many of our nation's many of our states' CO2 emitting activities. Carbon is not the only harmful pollutant, and climate change writ large is not the only injury wrought by the oil, gas, and chemical industries in Louisiana or elsewhere. If this task force is asking itself about a robust economy as relevant to its recommendations for climate action, which it clearly is, we clearly need to be taking simple steps. A wholesale transfer of all reallocation of public money, i.e. subsidies, tax breaks, and grants, from carbon-intensive industries to renewable energy sources like solar and carbon, the revocation of any permits for new or expanded greenhouse gas emitting facilities, and the adoption of policies fundamentally grounded in justice and support for Louisiana's people on whom our economy depends. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Patton. Other comments from our attendees? Seeing none, Lindsay, would you mind checking the climate@la.gov email for written comments?
Yes, I don't see any more hands raised on the attendee list, but if anyone does want to make a comment, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll promote you to a panelist. So on our climate@la.gov email, we have a lot of great comments on the draft portfolio, but I'm going to just find the few on industrial decarbonization. There is a comment from Ben Gordon, and he does not, he does list an affiliation. Pax Christie, USA and New Orleans Veterans for Peace. Robert Desmar Sullivan, he does not list an affiliation. Allison Rutenberg from Healthy Bull. Comment. Jane, I see your written comment as well. I see Kenitra Caston Hill's comment. And I see Catherine Hamilton's comment as well. I believe all of our other written comments are regarding the draft portfolio.
So let me ask, Lindsay, you're citing the comments, you're not actually reading them into the record, or what's the process here?
Harry, can you go over the
process? Append them officially to the meeting minutes, like we did with the last meeting, and so we'll make those available in draft minutes. But the comments will be appended, and we'll circulate that shortly after this meeting, so you can have them and don't have to wait to the next meeting to see those comments.
And I'll read the names of everyone who does submit the comments.
Okay, and that does it for the written comments.
Yes, that does it for the written.
Right, I don't see anyone with their hands raised. So once again, I want to thank you all for a very good discussion. Thank our panelists. Thank you, Heidi, for facilitating this discussion and keeping us on time. And really look forward to our next meeting in a couple of weeks to focus in on carbon capture and have a similar styled discussion to kind of pull back the layers on carbon capture and better understand that technology and its role in industrial decarbonization. And unless there's anything else, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Second.
All right, we have a motion by Professor Verchick, and a second by Camille Manning-Broom. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you all very much. Greatly appreciated.